Hi there, we're jumping back into the book of Hebrews at the end of the Hall of Faith, and we've had 3 sessions on the Hall of Faith. We've walked all the way from creation, and now we're going to walk all the way up until the beginning of the New Testament, actually probably into the intertestamental period. And what we want to do here is just look at the faith of all these people, and the author of Hebrews, what he's trying to do is connect the audience that's hearing his sermon that he's preaching with these men of old, and then connect them back again to the audience through the person of Jesus Christ, and say, look, all of these people are your forefathers in the faith, and you also have faith to the preserving of your soul, if you remember from the end of chapter 10. And then he's going to look forward to Christ in chapter 12 and say, listen, Jesus is the one who's the author and perfecter of faith, and he is the one who you should set your eyes upon and follow after. And so that's where the author is going. And so he closes out this section of the Hall of Faith with these last 10 verses, and we'll start in verse 30. In verse 30 it says, by faith the walls of Jericho fell down after they had been encircled for 7 days. And what's interesting here is that the author backs up from individuals and he looks at the entire nation. And if you remember, the entire nation at this time did have faith. The nation that came out of the wilderness, the nation in the wilderness died. He's already covered them in chapter 4. But here, the nation that came out of the wilderness was predominantly believers. And so by their faith, the walls of Jericho fell down. He doesn't talk about Joshua, interestingly enough. He just describes the falling of the walls of Jericho because of the faith of the entire nation at that moment. We see that exemplified in the fact that they were silent as they marched around the walls 7 times. Now, then, having backed way up, he zooms back in again and he deals with one individual, and this time it's a woman, and more than that, a harlot. This one of faith that he describes as Rahab in verse 31. By faith, Rahab the harlot did not perish along with those who were disobedient after she had welcomed the spies in peace. Now, what he says here is he connects her obedience with the disobedience of the people of Jericho who were unwilling to submit themselves to God and to Yahweh. And he says she wasn't disobedient. She knew that God had given them the land, and she was submissive to that reality, and so therefore she had genuine faith. She was really actually trusting in the God of Israel, and because of that trust that she had in the God of Israel, she welcomed the spies in peace. Now, obviously, the fact that she lied wasn't a good thing. That was a sinful thing that she did, and yet God used her to protect the spies, and therefore, and also to bring the armies to Jericho. There was a way around that without her lying and without her sinning. The author doesn't point out her sin, it just says that she welcomed the spies in peace. It's the welcoming of the spies, not the lying of the spies, that brings about the state of faith that Rahab has. Now, he moves again back, and he's going to zoom back again now, not only in people group, but also in history, and he speeds up the history, starting in verse 32. He says, and what more shall I say? For time will fail me if I tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel, and the prophets. So he whips us through the judges, and he comments on a number of them, some of them surprising, like Samson, and he says these are all men who by faith did many different things. And then in verse 33 he describes some of what they did. They conquered kingdoms, which we know happened. David conquered many kingdoms, and so did the other judges at various moments. They performed acts of righteousness. All of them did righteous things. They obtained promises. David obtained promises that were given to him about the coming Messiah. They shut the mouths of lions. Now again, we move forward to Daniel here. They quenched the power of fire. That's the Hebrew youths. In Babylon, they escaped the edge of the sword. Many of them fled from the sword. For example, Elijah fleeing from Jezebel. From weakness were made strong. They were weak and they became strong. In moments of weakness, they had strength. Became mighty in war. Again, we have David and others. They put foreign armies to flight. Again, many instances of that happening in the Old Testament. All of these things by faith. Verse 35, women receive back their dead by resurrection. This is a reference to both Elijah and Elisha, who both raised the child of a widow. Others were tortured, not accepting their release so that they might obtain a better resurrection. So you have the torturing, an unwillingness to be released so that they would have eternal life that is different and better than the resurrection, better than even the resurrection of the dead that Elijah and Elisha accomplished. Others experienced mockings and scourgings, yes, also chains and imprisonments. Mockings and scourgings, men were beaten, were severely treated, all sorts of evil things. They were stoned, they were sawn in two. That's a reference to Isaiah the prophet who was sawn in two with a wooden saw, most historians believe. They were tempted, many different temptations. They were tried. They were put to death with the sword. They were killed. So some escaped the sword, some were killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, and ill-treated. So we have this lengthy list of the sufferings and difficulties of being a person of faith in the Old Testament. And then in parentheses in verse 38, he says, men of whom the world was not worthy, wandering in deserts and mountains and caves and holes in the ground. What's fascinating here is that the author is saying, in spite of all the sufferings that these men and women of faith endured during all of these eras of time, that the world was not worthy of them. The world was living in comfort and luxury. The world was living in peace and prosperity, and yet these people of faith were suffering in dramatic ways. What's the author saying? The author's saying, listen, you Hebrews, who I'm writing to, I'm preaching to right now, don't you understand that as you're suffering, you're actually triumphing over the world? The world is not worthy of you any more than it was worthy of these people of faith from all of these generations that have already gone by. Suffering is not a sign of God's displeasure. Suffering is actually a sign, in the case of these people of faith, of God's care and pleasure and provision. The world wasn't worthy of them because they were righteous. They were walking in faith. And so the author is connecting them with the idea of faith and saying, listen, maintain your faith, because by maintaining your faith, you are following in the footsteps of these saints of old who were not worthy, of whom the world was not worthy. And so he's saying, listen, you have the same faith that they have, and you're going to follow in their footsteps in this trajectory of faith, and all of that is now pointing like a giant arrow toward the one who has given them the faith. That is the Messiah, Jesus Christ. And in verse 39, he's going to make this connection explicit. He says, and all these, having gained approval through their faith, did not receive what was promised. Now, what is that? He looks backwards and he says that all of these people, they didn't get it. They gained approval, God approved of them, but they didn't obtain the promise. What was the promise? Well, a number of things that are promised. It says, verse 40, God had provided something better for us, so that apart from us, they would not be made perfect. So he says they didn't get the promise, right? But God has given us something better, and then with us together, we obtain the promise. With us together, we are made perfect. We're made whole. So the Old Testament saints, New Testament saints gathered together are made perfect, are made whole together. Now, what's fascinating here, if you just take this apart a little bit, is that what promises they didn't obtain, we now have somehow obtained in some capacity, right? God has given us something better, but that with them now we are made perfect together. What are the two things that he's talking about there? Well, the promises that we've obtained are ultimately the new covenant promises found in the person of Jesus Christ. What have we obtained that's better? Well, it's Jesus, who we're going to fix our eyes on in chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. That's exactly where he's going to head from the new covenant. They didn't understand the blessings, and they were believers, they had received approval, but they didn't understand all the implications of the blessings of the new covenant and Christ in us through the person of the Holy Spirit, because those things had yet to be fully realized in the new covenant era. However, we do have those things. God has given us something better than all those men of faith who gained approval. We have something better in the new covenant, and that's exactly what the author of Hebrews wants to encourage his listeners by. However, there's an additional component to that. That doesn't mean that that's the end of all these things. There is something future that God has promised, where both the Old Testament and New Testament saints will be gathered together and receive something that is essentially the blessing, the perfect blessing that God provided. What is that? That thing. And to know that thing, we have to go back to Abraham. What was it that Abraham was still waiting for in terms of his promise? The thing that he was waiting for in terms of his promise is ultimately the blessings of the land. And so what God is providing here is the millennial kingdom, where both Old Testament and New Testament saints will come together in a place of perfection, in perfection together. They will be made perfect because of the promises of God, the approval that they've gained, and the blood of the Messiah, who has now cleansed the past sins. Romans chapter 3, verses 25 and 26. And Old Testament saints, New Testament saints coming together into this blessing and receiving in its finality the promises that were made to Abraham, so that both blessing, seed, and land will all be fulfilled to Abraham, and ultimately really to all of the saints of old and the New Testament saints. The author of Hebrews is taking all these things and he's putting the present saints in their suffering into that category. He's saying, listen, the world isn't worthy of you guys. You're suffering, but that's okay. God has a plan for you. That's exactly what he's going to do. And when he exits this section and goes to chapter 12, who's he going to look at? He's going to look at Christ, who will ultimately be the king, who will fulfill the promises that have been made to the nation and to the peoples in the church. This is God's plan. That's exactly what the author of Hebrews is trying to connect together. Such an important verse for us when we're in a situation of difficulty and trial, because what's it showing us? It's showing us that in times of difficulty and trial, we can still cling fast to the reality of our faith and trust in God who loves us. I hope that's encouraging to you. We always want to encourage you, take some time, read the commentary. It's extremely extensive. This video does not do it justice, and there's some great questions to consider. Also, I know many of you are doing care groups together and going through this study as well, so I hope you're encouraged by that as well. Thank you so much for praying for each one of you.